looking into some of the reaction to Julio Jones signing with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, what that might mean. We also got the news that it looks like Chris Godwin is quite a bit ahead of where we anticipated that he may be in terms of his recovery. So it's going to be interesting to see how that affects all of the Buccaneers, I guess, in general, but Mike Evans as well and his current ADP. Shawn, you had an instant reaction piece up on RotoViz.com. It went out very shortly after this, and we're going to dive into it to start today's show. We will get to those questions later in the podcast. But Shawn, it was reported certain teams Julio could go to. I don't think we really had it pegged that he may go to the Buccaneers. The one thing I'll say I was right about is he was going to wait to go to a team that could potentially win a Super Bowl. So he lands with Tampa Bay, lands with Tom Brady. What were your immediate thoughts on the news? And was it a double whammy looking into the Buccaneers situation with both the Godwin news and the Julio news? I think if we hadn't got the Godwin news at the same time, people would have thought, oh, this isn't good for Chris Godwin. So it was interesting to get both of those in such close proximity.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, is that if we hadn't also found out that Godwin is probably ahead of schedule, then you would think there'd be some pretty big concerns there. There's also the case to be made that depending on when the signing happened, you could argue that it was a pretty bad sign for Russell Gage, that they weren't that happy with what he was giving early in training camp, even though obviously Russell Gage and Julio Jones are two very different types of players. It's a good reminder that not everything is a message about this or an insight about that. Sometimes it's just teams going out there and trying to put the most powerful squad on the field that they possibly can. And we know that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have had that MO over the past several years as they go for Super Bowls down the stretch of Brady's career. And it looked like last season might be the swan song, might be the end. But then once he comes back, they're right back into win now mode. And this is a fun signing. I was able to get the reaction piece out because I was actually working on a Mike Evans article, one of those discount pieces where we look at players who have a lot of similarities and probably are going to give you almost the entire production and yet at a pretty significant discount. One of the reasons why Evans would be interesting there is that he was very expensive in the second round of drafts. And he was very expensive despite the fact that his profile was showing fairly significant signs of decline, right? So over the past 2 years, he has 13 and 14 touchdowns, trails only Devontae Adams in the touchdown department over the last 2 seasons. You look at him obviously playing with Aaron Rodgers. Well, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, right? They ranked number 1 last season in both overall and situation neutral pass rate. Tom Brady leads the league with over 5,300 yards passing. He sneaks out the passing touchdown title with 43. And so when you don't have Rob Gronkowski, you don't have Antonio Brown, you're probably not going to get a lot for Chris Godwin until midseason. It looks, at least on the surface, like Mike Evans is this fantastic pick. And yet when you go in and look at his profile, the target market share declined significantly over the past several seasons. The target depth declined significantly. And what does that mean? Well, 2018, 2019, 23, 24% market share. That's still not a huge number compared to the receivers that we tend to see as first and early second round picks, but solid within the context of a passing offense that is pretty high powered, right? We talked about how the Bucs led in these different passing categories, but over the past couple seasons, dropped to 18%, 17%. Then that target depth, 2018, 2019, he's a little bit over 15 yards. The last 2 years drops to 12.2, 13.2. The overall air yards are down. The yards per reception falls from over 17 to in that 14-yard area. Now, those are still good numbers, especially when you add in the touchdowns. And so if you look at this from the perspective of, okay, the target share is down because he's competing with so many good wide receivers. I mean, Antonio Brown, even kind of here at the end with some of the different mental health problems or whatever you want to look at, behavioral problems that he has had, still a dynamic receiver. Obviously, Chris Godwin, the overall wide receiver too, just a couple of years ago. You're not going to have that same target share when you're competing with those guys. But then you go in and you look at it in a little bit more detail. You pull up the stealing signals tool and look at it on a per route basis. And you can see that he was actually targeted less frequently than Godwin, Gronkowski, Antonio Brown, and even Leonard Fournette, right? Now, those guys are running different numbers of routes. Evans is up there at the top, and yet that's still a little bit of a red flag. So then we look a little bit deeper and we look at the 2022 situation, especially now that we have these signings. And I think that you do have to move Mike Evans down because we see that he was actually targeted less frequently on a per route basis than Russell Gage. He gained fewer yards per route than Gage. And his target profile actually very similar to what Julio Jones did last year, even in a season where people look at Julio Jones and feel like maybe he's washed because the Titans didn't want to bring him back. But the yards per target for Evans and Jones, almost identical, 9.1 and 9.0. The targets per route, 21% for Jones, 20% for Evans. Obviously, that's going to give you yard per route numbers that are almost identical because those are the two components. The one difference there is that Julio obviously didn't run nearly as many routes. He wasn't healthy during the course of the season. His route percentage in those games where he did play was only 65% compared to 77% for Evans. Definitely not saying that these two guys are the same player, but when you look at the relative prices now, Jones becomes pretty interesting and Evans becomes pretty scary, especially as you mentioned with Godwin getting in there. And the issue with Godwin isn't just that maybe he avoided PUP. I still think that they're going to take it easy with him. That's what they have said. I think that the signing of Jones takes the pressure off for him to be super involved early in the season. But if you're drafting a Mike Evans in the second round, there's so much focus right now on like, how do you win in week 16? How do you win in week 17? That focus is very good. If you want to win tournaments, you need to know those elements and be prepared to put together a team that will win in those weeks. At the same time, when you're talking about players who were drafted in the first 2, 3, 4 rounds, they need to win for you at the beginning. They need to win for you in the middle. They need to win for you at the end. If Evans is going to be down, below 20% target share down the stretch of the season, which, with this group of receivers, you could easily see, then he's simply not a second round pick. And the price there, I don't think made sense the whole time because you are really relying on some of those touchdowns. Now, the flip side of that column is that there are still concerns about Julio and where he is. There are going to be concerns about Godwin throughout the season, anytime when someone is on an accelerated path back from a fairly serious injury. Russell Gage, someone I trumpeted what he did last year, but also in the article, I do go through kind of the splits pre and post Calvin Ridley. And he benefited a lot from Ridley being gone. He's not someone now, especially where his ADP makes any sense. And so you would expect all of these guys to slide some. Mike Evans, definitely a player who could still be a big help early. And then within the context of this offense, if those touchdowns come during week 16 and week 17, which we know that they could do. When you're talking about how do you win a tournament, you need touchdown scoring superstars. And Evans still has that. So I think that you can look at this from a variety of angles. His ADP should fall, and it should fall further than I've seen in the first couple of drafts that I've done post-signing. At the same time, he's still one of these receivers who falls into that third to mid fourth round range.
Yeah, that's very fair. And actually, you're mentioning where he's sliding. I'm doing a slow co-managed draft, and we're picking at the 103. And in the second round, he had slid back to the 209 there, and we took Mike Evans. I haven't really drafted him. We've joked about the early draft slots, so I haven't really been drafting him or targeting him. He hasn't been in the conversation from where he's been going. So maybe it was just that little itch, but when he was sliding down those extra couple of picks, there was kind of another few players I'm hoping will come back to us. And T. Higgins did go one pick ahead of him. So, got one of my first shares of Mike Evans. But you touched on the concerns. You also touched on the potential upsides. And I think when we're drafting those rosters, we're going to try and diversify. But moving forward from that, with Mike Evans, I think where you mentioned there, kind of probably mid third to mid fourth. I think he probably will settle, between the 303 and the 308 kind of range. I think he'll be a little bit higher than that. Do you think he starts to slide all the way into the mid fourth? We have to think that Godwin's ADP is probably going to start to creep up a little bit over the last couple of months. If we look at the tracking on both Underdog and FFPC, Gage has obviously come up quite a bit. Godwin has started to tail off a little bit, but not much, kind of around below where he was going at the start. We've seen the opposite, where we've seen Evans go up the round. I think Evans probably goes back to where he originally was. And do you think there's a chance that we see, if we get positive reports on Godwin, that he intersects with Evans and possibly is the first wide receiver for the Buccaneers off the board? The other part of that question is, I do think that Godwin doesn't go back to Gage doesn't go back to where he was before all this happened, but I do think we probably see him slide 2 to 3 rounds.
I don't think that Godwin can get up to that territory because he's also now fighting with Julio Jones. And one of the things that we saw last year, and it was a little bit fluky because it wasn't just Antonio Brown's presence or absence, but there was a fluky week 6 game where Evans and Godwin both didn't score particularly well. But one of the things that you do notice is the Godwin's win rate last year before Antonio Brown got hurt was not great. Right now, it was well above average for the first 5 weeks before he had that disastrous week 6 performance. But then it was after Brown is gone that he jumps back up there and is around 11% when he himself gets injured. I mean, Julio Jones, still someone, and I think especially in this offense, that you have to take pretty seriously. I still think that Godwin is a late season hammer type of play, and I don't think that you can take that really much above where he's currently going. The tricky part with Evans is, he's in that tier between Michael Pittman at wide receiver 11 and Deontay Johnson at wide receiver 19. It seems like Pittman is probably being a little bit overdrafted. The range of outcomes tool kind of agrees with our site ranking, which has him a little bit lower. And I don't want this to be like an anti-Michael Pittman. The idea that he's going to get this big bump with Matt Ryan and benefit, not to the level of like a Cooper Kupp, but benefit and be up there ahead of the Chargers wide receivers, I think is a little bit odd. For me now, it would be hard to take Mike Evans ahead of the Chargers wide receivers because you're talking about guys who in a lot of ways are probably pretty similar. Now, Keenan Allen, a similar type of player to Mike Evans in terms of having this long track record of production. They're obviously different players. Their skill sets manifest differently out on the football field. Mike Williams, a guy who probably is more similar stylistically to Mike Evans and had a really strong first month and a half of the season before he suffered an injury. And that injury is probably the only thing actually holding him down out of the 2-3 turn. Almost certainly, I think, would be going ahead of Pittman if not for that injury. And you look at the situation there with the Chargers, they have Justin Herbert. Is that as good or potentially better than Tom Brady? Since Herbert, you would assume, is ascending, Herbert is definitely ascending. The assumption, I guess, is on Tom Brady and whether or not you think that he is going to decline a little bit. One of the things that he's been insistent about there with the Buccaneers is to have the weapons so that he can ward off that decline or balance out any type of physical issues that he is having. But the Chargers also now have less target competition. And so for those two players to go behind Mike Evans now, I don't think that would make sense. So I think that you have to like them above where he is. They're also in that potential week 17 shootout with the Rams. That could be a lot of fun. So that's kind of where I would put Evans. I think that he then falls into that range where you have Jalen Waddle, Cortland Sutton, Marquise Brown, Deontay Johnson. Definitely would go still above Terry McLaurin and Allen Robinson, who are kind of in the back half of the 4th round. I think this puts Russell Gage now in the Jacoby Myers area of wide receiver 60. And again, that's not any kind of huge criticism. Jacoby Myers is a good wide receiver, but you're looking at the potential for him to really impact the offense and have those big target numbers. It's just not there if Julio Jones is going to be there. Now, we still may find out that Jones has to prove something even to make the team. And if that's the case, then I think you can hold in with some of these other Buccaneers receivers a little bit more. But in that case, it would be Chris Godwin whom I'd be targeting, not the other two players.